Thank you. Getting my voice nice and loud? Right. I've got two of these things here. Just hope I don't get twisted in them. You can probably hear my heartbeat going through it. When Libby rang me to tell me of this award, I experienced the spectrum of emotions. Surprise came first, then thankfulness, followed by a lovely glow of pleasure. Later, when I looked at the list of previous winners and recognised the honour and responsibility, I became nervous, almost fearful, and some of that still remains. A touch more than I normally experience when I'm speaking, and I'm hoping that by the end of this, it will change to the warm feeling of satisfaction. Thank you, everyone who has brought me to this point in my writing career. Those involved with the administration of the award, the nominators and the judges, those who organised this day, and also the publishers, the editors, the publicists, librarians, and all those people who ensure that what I write ends up in the hands of a reader. I would also like to thank my wife, Lynn, at this stage. Thanks, Lynn, and thanks to everybody else who's been involved. I have pondered over this speech for weeks, trying to identify what special knowledge or understanding I might have that was worthy of being passed on today. I did jot down some notes, but was not convinced by any of them. Then a month ago, I had another speaking engagement, one which didn't turn out quite the way I had hoped. It did, however, focus my attention. And what you get today results from the analysis I did after that previous event. The first thing I came up with was that I needed to carry a staff, a strong stick that would support me when I'm wobbly, but also one that could perform a little magic. Something like a wizard's staff from The Lord of the Rings. The three wizards of Middle-earth, Gandalf the Grey, Saruman the White, and Radagast the Brown, always carried a staff, and powerful things they were too. They could destroy mountains, those staffs. They could... Right now, I'm going to interrupt myself. Because if I was doing this at a school and made that statement about Middle-earth, a hand would have gone up. It would be a boy. He would have put up his hand. He wouldn't wave it furiously. He'd put it up and it'd look very serious. And I'd try to ignore it for a while. But eventually I'd have to either tell him to put it down or ask what he wanted. So eventually I would look at him and say, yes, sighing as I did so. Then he'd stand, and when he spoke, it would be very, very seriously. Actually, he'd say, clearly pronouncing every syllable, actually, there are 5 wizards in Middle-earth. You said there were 3. You missed out the blue wizards, Palando and Alatar. He would then go on and on about the blue wizards, and I'd have to find some friendly way of stopping him so I could resume the presentation. I mention this not because I find these boys annoying, but because I was once like that. Still am to some extent. My specialty was science, particularly chemistry. If someone made an inaccurate statement about chemicals or chemistry, I was onto it. Even today, if someone says something like, wrap it in tin foil and put it in the fridge, or we'll use the tin boat, I will turn to them and say, actually, it's made from aluminium, not tin. The element tin is far too expensive, but aluminium is not. Ever since the whole process was invented in 1886, and on I'll go, just like the boy who knows everything about Middle-earth. Last year in Gisborne, I very nearly got into an argument with one of these boys. In my presentation, I tell the students that I couldn't play computer games when I was a child because computers hadn't been invented. As soon as the words were out of my mouth, a hand went up. I stopped and said that I'd take questions up at the end. The hand went down. During question time, it went up again. I carefully ignored him until that hand was the only one left. Yes, I said, knowing exactly what his first word would be. Actually, he said, you're wrong about the invention of computers. Charles Babbage invented them in 1831 when, by then my eyes had narrowed. My nostrils had flared. Wrong? I was thinking, is he saying I'm wrong? You see, the history of computing is one of my subjects. This boy had to be corrected. Actually, I said, I was talking about electronic computers, not mechanical ones. Anyway, Babbage's differences machine was never finished and didn't work. I was about to go on and tell him that he was wrong because the invention was 1832, not 1831. But some sort of sanity returned and I let it be. Fortunately, so did he, otherwise we'd still be at it today. Getting back to the staff. The speaking engagement that gave rise to it was at the Hamilton's Gardens Arts Festival. The Book Council had organised an event in the Japanese Garden of Contemplation with the title True Stories Out Loud. 4 writers had been invited to stand up and tell a story. The instructions were that the story should be vaguely true, have a beginning, middle and an end, in other words, the story arc. They should each last 7 to 10 minutes and should be unscripted storytelling without notes, props or prompts. The writers chosen were a journalist, a poet, a dramatist, and me, the novelist. The day before, 3 of us, along with some other writers, had been doing a writing workshop at St. Peter's in Cambridge. Over morning tea, we discussed the festival event. One of the writers said she had turned it down, thinking it was too difficult. 2 who had accepted expressed nervousness about the performance, being unsure how it would go. I said nothing, because at that stage I had no concerns whatsoever. And I still had no concerns the next day. Not until I walked into the room and stood in front of that microphone. That's when the shaking began. So severe that I felt I was wobbling on my feet. My mouth went dry and I was close to being tongue-tied, something I have not experienced for decades. I did get through my story, albeit in a muddled way. And at the end, the applause seemed to be genuine. But I was far from happy. Was this the first sign of decay? Was this a glimpse of my future? Over the following days, I revisited that talk several times, trying to identify the cause of my discomfort. I couldn't blame the organisation of the event, as it was as smooth as I've come to expect from the Book Council. The problem was with me. I eventually identified it as this. It was the absence of props. There was nothing of mine or me in that space, nothing that would help me when the words were faltering. I can't remember when I last spoke in such an environment, one that had nothing of me other than my clothed body. When I visit schools, I surround myself with objects of science and the books that have meaning to me. I change the environment until I am comfortable within it. That didn't happen at Hamilton Gardens, and I felt sure that if I'd had just one prop, it would have made all the difference. Which got me thinking to the devices that many other children's writers use, the hats, the vests, the funny clothes, Margaret Mahy and her wigs. I'm sure most people here can at this very moment envisage Margaret in a rainbow-coloured wig. And the image will lead to other memories about Margaret, her stories, her places, her values. I began to think that maybe some such emblem would be of help to me in some circumstances. Not a wig or fancy clothes, that's not me. Although I did look at a purple hat at one stage while we were shopping in Spotlight. In the end, I went for a walking aid, partly because my balance is not so good these days, but mostly because of an experience when I was a younger man. This was back in my electronics computing period. I was in Christchurch to speak at an international conference featuring the Logo programming language. On the first day, all the participants were bused to a local marae for a porphyry, where one of the speakers was an elderly kaumatua. He had a wonderful carved stick, a toko, which he used as both a support, a speaking aid. As he listed his whakapapa, he highlighted things with his stick: the sky, the earth, carvings of the wharenui. He spoke for quite some time, and all of this, as the Book Council memo would put it, unscripted storytelling, without notes, props or prompts. Well, it was certainly unscripted and without notes, but was that stick a prop? I don't think so. I got the impression it was much more than a third leg for support or an extension of his arm for pointing. To me, it seemed to be part of his very being. I felt sure that without that toko, he would have experienced difficulties reciting his whakapapa. It was helping him in ways that were more than just physical. And that's what I hoped for my staff. Except I knew this one wasn't going to do that. I didn't cut it from a tree and carve it into shape. This is an ancient North American Indian one. Well, that's what the ad on eBay said. Actually, I'm a little suspicious about its origins because the eBay ad showed it being held by a young woman wearing a skimpy suede leather skirt. Now, I had worked out that she was not included in the purchase, even though the ad never stated that. But she didn't look particularly ancient. And then when the staff arrived at home, I found it was made of plastic. While ancient Amerindians are not one of my subjects, I did start to wonder about the authenticity of this. If I was going to use a staff, then I knew it had to be much more than this. It had to be something that I had created and had meaning to me. And this is what I came up with. The cow on the top is significant. You see, all the magic, those three wizards in The Lord of the Rings, came from the top of the staff. Saruman's even had a crystal embedded in the top which glowed blue when it was doing its magic, destroying armies and the like. The magic from my staff also comes from the top. The cow was given to me by Rangatahi House at the end of my 30 years at Rosehill College. At that time, the cow was their symbol. I suspect there was some other message in it when they gave it to me as well, but I've never quite worked out what it is. While this cow might not be magical, it certainly has meaning for me and deserves a place on top of my staff. But it's not the only thing I can put there. The thing about this staff that I've made is that I can change the magical thing on the top. I can use it to do all sorts of things. So let's get rid of the cow. And I will replace it with this. I've searched the internet for the name of an object on top of a walking stick without success. Until I get a better word, I'm going to call it a totem. According to Google, a totem is defined as a natural object that has a special relationship to a person, family or clan. The Kiwi has a special relationship to me, as it does for many New Zealanders. It reminds me of the two times when I've seen a Kiwi in the wild, Kapiti and Stewart Islands. It also represents my strong feelings about this country, the people, the landscapes, the active geology and the wildlife. I'm proud to be known as a Kiwi. Also, at the moment, this totem is a reference to my current writing, which is a Kiwi story set around Kerikeri in the Waitangi forest. But I can change this to other things as things develop in my writing career. I know next year I will be using this quite a bit. During 2018, my story Broken Poppies will be released. That book, the last in Scholastic's Kiwis at War series, commemorates 100 years since the signing of the armistice that ended the First World War. I'd be surprised if this totem doesn't get several outings, and I think it will be excellent to be able to use this in schools. The totem I would have used at Hamilton Gardens a month ago is this. I'm going to tell the story here because it gives hints to the origins of the adventure stories I would write 50 years later. I'll just park my stuff. The year was 1954 and I was aged 12. The place was Palmerston North, where I lived my first 18 years. My closest friend was Graham, who had similar scientific interests to me, although he was more archaeology than chemistry. During weekends and school holidays, we were allowed to do pretty much what we liked, within the constraints of the values maintained by our families. Day after day, we would go off on our bikes, seeking adventure. Sometimes we found it in the city, other times we rode miles into the countryside. Often we joined up with other groups of boys. We weren't the only ones given such freedom. On the day that this bottle represents, Graham wanted to explore the southern end of town, towards Longburn, where Scandinavians had first settled in the 1860s. I knew that end of town well, because it was part of our our milk run. Dad was a milk vendor, and I had to help him on weekends and school holidays. But our run finished at the edge of town, and the houses that Graham wanted to visit were on farmland outside the city, so it was new territory for me as well. As usual, during the ride through town, we smoked a couple of cigarettes. This was definitely outside the values set by our parents. But all the boys our age were doing it, secretly of course, as it was against the law, or so we'd been told. Once we got south of town, we rode around looking for a suitable place to investigate. The one we picked was a huge two-storied wooden house, chosen because of two broken-down sheds out the back. We knocked on the door. Well, Graham did. He interacted with people far better than I ever did. When nobody answered, we decided to take a quick peek in the sheds to see if it was worthwhile coming back later. The first was a wool shed that was still getting some use. It didn't seem anything special. The other shed, however, ended up being pure gold. It was the old carriage house, and the carriages were still parked inside, along with the paraphernalia that went with that era. We couldn't resist exploring further. Anyway, there was no side to the shed, so we weren't breaking and entering or anything like that. To us, it seemed as if the carriages were almost inviting us in. Sometime in the past, they'd been backed in after a day of use and never taken out again. The first thing I noticed was that the best of the carriages had carbide headlamps. I knew about carbide lamps and how they worked. Water dripping on calcium carbide made acetylene, which was then burnt to give light. The reaction also makes an impurity which has a strong, unpleasant smell. I knew that calcium carbide could be used to make stink bombs. While Graham explored the carriages, I went looking for any carbide that might still be around. On the rear wall was a shelf that had bottles and jars of all shapes and sizes. Some contained oils, others horse medicines and the like. I didn't find any carbide, but I did find 2 soft drink bottles. Like this one. Despite being empty and filthy, they were still worth money. 3 each, if cleaned up and taken back to Dixon's cordial factory. Collecting bottles to get the refund was something all boys did to supplement their pocket money. 4 bottles of those, and you got enough to buy a packet of 10 cigarettes. I took the bottles and put them in the bag behind the seat of my bike. Eventually we became bored with this adventure and headed back home, sneaking another cigarette or 2 on the way. Graham lived a couple of streets across from us, so he separated off and I continued on to our place in Knowles Street. Arriving at our house, I was shocked to find a police car was parked in our driveway. This was well outside the values of our family. This was shameful. My first thought was that someone had seen us smoking and reported it to the police, and they were now telling my parents. However, when I went inside, I found that everyone was showing concern more than anger. Desmond, said my father, he always called me Desmond the whole of his life. These policemen have some questions. It turned out that it wasn't about smoking at all. It was about visiting the property at the other end of town. It wasn't even about trespassing. It was about stealing bottles. Did you take a bottle? Asked one of the policemen. Yes. Where is it? In the bag on my bike. Go get it. I went outside and came back with 1 of the bottles. My thinking was that stealing just 1 might be less of a crime than stealing 2. When they saw the bottle, their expressions changed to puzzlement. Is that the only bottle you took? Oh heck, they were on to me. So out I went and got the other one. But this still didn't make them any happier. They wanted to know if there were any others. There weren't, and I told them that. Only then did they tell me what they were looking for. Apparently, after the owner of the property arrived home, he'd got a phone call from a neighbour who said some kids had been messing around in the shed. The farmer rushed out to take a look to see what we'd done. When he saw that we'd been into the bottles, he panicked and ran back to the house to ring the police. He told them that we'd taken a bottle of strychnine, a poison that he used to kill rats. The police immediately contacted the neighbour, who said one of the boys was the milkman's son, which then led them to our house and me. Now at last I understood their concern, for I knew about poisons. The big 3 was cyanide, arsenic and strychnine, and they killed people. Well, they definitely did in some of the stories I read. I certainly appreciated why everyone was so concerned. What I didn't appreciate was the telling off I got because somebody else, the farmer, had been wrong. I never heard if the farmer ever found his strychnine or not. I imagine he did, probably in the other shed in exactly the place where he'd put it. What annoyed me the most, however, was that I had been identified as the culprit so quickly, even before I got home. For the first time I realised that people were watching us, spying on us as we had our adventures, busybodies with nothing better to do. After that, our adventures never felt quite the same again. Only as an adult have I come to understand what was really happening there. Although by that stage Palmerston North had a population of 35,000, it had a culture similar to that of a village. More than just the parents took an interest in the upbringing of the children. Others in the community would step in as required. The freedom that Graham and I valued so much was not restricted by this culture. It existed because of the culture. Our parents could let us go off on our adventures knowing that if we overstepped too far, other people would step in to remind us of our responsibilities. Many of those adventures were the seeds that have grown into stories I write today. And if you've noticed that my characters have considerable freedom of movement and experience, that's no accident. It is the way I would like the life of a child to be. My next totem is a gecko. Not just any old gecko, a giant gecko. Much, much bigger than that. It represents my first published novel, A Friend in Paradise. I'd been a published author for almost 30 years when my gecko book came out. Altogether, there had been 14 non-fiction titles ranging from thin 24-page readers up to full 50-page texts. But I'd not had anything for 15 years. Half of that time had been spent developing electronic systems for the teaching of physics. The other half was learning to write fiction. I had in mind that the ideas I'd used to interest youngsters in science through my textbooks could be adapted to fiction. I wanted to write stories that included science and nature in a way that children, particularly boys, would find interesting. And not just any stories, they would be New Zealand stories, Kiwi stories for Kiwi kids. Despite the transition from non-fiction being much harder than I'd anticipated, I eventually came up with something that HarperCollins were prepared to publish. 6 months later came the excitement of receiving my first copy. That wonderful moment when I held the book to my chest and experienced the thrill of achievement. By this time, this is 2002, I'd been teaching at Coromandel Area School for 3 years. They knew that I'd written texts in the past, but I'd not told them anything of my fiction aspirations, mostly because of fears of failure. On the day that the book was released, HarperCollins had arranged an interview on Radio NZ National afternoon program. As this was during class time, I had to get a reliever to look after my class while I did the telephone interview. That meant telling management what was happening. When the AP heard about it, she demanded a copy of the book to read that night. Well, the next morning at staff briefing, she stands up and gives a review to the whole of the staff. A Friend in Paradise, she said, is a story about grief and how new experiences can help with the grieving process. I was flabbergasted. She was so wrong. I wanted to stand up and shout, "No, it's not. Actually, it's about a giant gecko called Oplodactylus delcorti, known to the Maori as kaweo. It was killed off by humans and is now..." Oh, I could have gone on for hours about it. Meanwhile, the AP was telling the staff about the main character who has lost his father to cancer and is sent to a farm near Apothecary. Yes, that was all true, but that wasn't why I wrote the story. I wanted kids to learn about kaweo and the environmental effects of human activities. To me, the father's death was just simply a way of getting the boy to the area where the kaweo once lived. At no stage did I see it as a story about grieving. Of course, I didn't interrupt the AP to enlighten her. I let her finish her piece. And for the rest of the day, basked in the congratulations of the staff and students as news spread of my achievement. It ended up being a particularly memorable day. I learnt a lot from this gecko and its story. First of all, I discovered that the human story is more important than the animal one. I do still start by thinking of an animal and building a story about that, around that, but I now know it is a human story I'm telling. While, for example, I can represent Whale Pot Bay, with this wonderful whale tooth. I do think of that book more as my blended family story than one about whales. The second thing I discovered was that the majority of my readers were girls, not the boys whom I'd originally targeted. Mostly this was a consequence of more girls reading fiction than boys, so it should not have come as a surprise. What did come as a surprise was the third thing. It is this: more children hear my stories than read them. That was a revelation to me. Not long after A Friend in Paradise had been released, the teacher at Coromandel told me it was a good read-aloud story. She asked if I read aloud when I was writing, and I said that I did, and I still do. Not with full voice, or that would be very annoying for my family, but not quite subvocal either, a gentle whisper, a breeze, swishing leaves. And she had identified that was probably one of the reasons why my books are often considered to be good read-aloud stories. Here's another aside. My parents never read to me as a child, nor did my siblings, who were both much older than me. As far as I can remember, neither did my teachers, not in the way they do today, where chapter books are told in serial form over several weeks. Despite this, I was an avid reader and frequent user of the Palmerston North Public Library. I read all sorts of things, many of them inappropriate for my age. And of course, they had words that I didn't know, but I would work out their meaning along with a way to pronounce them. Unfortunately, more often than not, I got that last bit wrong. And when I used those words, people would laugh, but I've learnt to live with that. As far as writing was concerned, I never wrote for personal enjoyment, like some children do. If asked to in class, I was happy enough to produce something or other. That was until my third form year. At the start of the year, the English teacher asked us to write a piece detailing, that was his word, detailing, a typical day in the summer holidays. As usual, I took the instruction literally. He wanted details. I gave him details. I described getting out of bed, walking to the toilet, how I used the toilet, how I flushed the toilet, how the water flowed into the bowl. Then after that, getting dressed, moving to the kitchen, fixing breakfast, eating breakfast. By the time I was just getting to the good part where I went outside to feed my birds, we were told to stop. All would have been well if the teacher had not chosen me as the first person to read their piece out loud. I'd only got to the part where I'd flushed the toilet when they started laughing, just as you did a moment ago. Yes, it did sound funny, and soon I was giggling too, but not the teacher. He thought I was taking the mickey. Our relationship went downhill from there, and I began to hate the subject English. In school certificate, I got 36%, just enough to get me through to the sixth form. My science and maths were considerably better. And what that did was bring me back into conflict with my third form English teacher. I remember one lesson in particular. We were asked to do an analysis of Crossing the Bar, a poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Some of you will know it. I'll read the last two stanzas to give you some idea. Twilight and evening bell, and after that the dark. And may there be no sadness of farewell when I embark. For though from out our bourne of time and place, the flood may bear me far, I hope to see my pilot face to face when I have crossed the bar. Once again, I took it literally. I never gave it a thought that this might be a metaphor for dying. I wrote a lengthy piece about a fishing boat attempting to cross the Manawatu River Bar, which I knew quite a bit about. Of course, that didn't go well at all. And this time the teacher went out of his way to ridicule me in front of the whole class. Fortunately, back then you could be accredited university entrance, and my performance in the sciences and maths got me through to the 7th form, where I could take an extra science instead of English. I didn't have to go to another English class ever again. But fortunately, that was not the end of my instruction in that subject. By 1972, I'd been teaching 8 years then, science education in New Zealand was undergoing radical changes. A teacher at Rangitoto College called Maurice Petrel was writing texts to support this revolution. Originally, he'd been an English teacher, but had swapped over to science with a specialty subject, biology. He wanted someone to write the physical sciences parts of the text, and he thought I was that person. I have no doubts that he had second thoughts when he first read my writing. But instead of sacking me, he set about teaching me to write. At that time, I was teaching at Rosehill College in Papakura, 50 kilometres away from Morris. So we did it all over the phone. I'd write my pieces, send them to him, and then he'd rip them apart in phone calls that often took hours. It was brutal, but it worked. It worked because it's what is called just... Most of the education we do in schools is just-in-case education. And this was just when needed. I wanted to write. I wanted to have my ideas go further outside of just the classes I taught, and so I was prepared to learn to write. I wouldn't be standing here today if it weren't for the effort Maurice put in way back then. Some of you will recognise which book this might represent. In the early days of writing fiction, I would repeat a mantra when I was writing, and it was this: write for the reader, I'd mumble, write for the reader. Whenever I was having troubles, write for the reader. This was to remind me to always consider how the things I write will seem to the reader. And it wasn't just any reader I was thinking of, it was boy readers, the ones who weren't particularly turned on by fiction, the ones who take everything literally. As it turned out, writing for them seemed to work for a much wider range of readers and also listeners, because increasingly my stories were being read to classes. By the time Frog Whistle Mine was published, I had started writing for the listener as well as the reader. Some were simple changes, such as making sure the character names sounded quite different so that they couldn't be confused by poor listeners. Other changes required much more work. Reading dialogue out loud can be tricky because the listener can't see the new paragraphs that indicate a change of speaker. Sure, some readers can do lots of different voices, but most of us can't. Therefore, more speaker or action tags are needed. And while this may seem clumsy writing to the reader, they are essential if the listener is going to make sense of the dialogue. The structure of a chapter also needs a lot of attention. First of all, I tried to make them the same length so that they will better suit the timing in a classroom. They should also be a story in themselves, so that listeners feel good about what they've just heard. This means that a chapter must follow the story arc with a beginning, middle and end. I consider the ending to be critical, and I'm going to give you an example. Listen to this one. Max went to bed that night, pleased with how the day had gone. Soon he was asleep and pleasantly dreaming. However, if he'd known what was happening at that moment on the other side of town, those dreams would have quickly turned into nightmares. Many boys hearing this will get annoyed. I know nothing about girls, but I suspect many of them would too. That last sentence is such an obvious page-turning ploy. It is trickery, and the boys I've been talking about don't like that form of trickery. See, what the writer is effectively saying is this: I know a secret, but I'm not telling you. We don't like that. It makes us feel different in an unpleasant way. We're being left out of things, and that happens far too often to us. Now listen to this ending. Max went to bed that night pleased with how the day had gone. He quickly fell asleep, content in the knowledge that at last all his problems were finally over. I can almost guarantee that if I were to read this to a class, some boy would yell out, "Oh no, it's not." That boy isn't annoyed, he's smiling, he's pleased, he has become involved in the story. He's now part of the telling of it. And how does he know that Max's problems are not finally over? Well, apart from what's happening in the story, he can see the book and there's still half of it left. The thing is he's now anticipating the next instalment, partly because he's opened the opportunity for an "I told you so," which is something us boys really, really like. You might have some trouble seeing this one. It is a kiwi and a pukeko, and they're not too happy about things. I think they've had a quarrel about which bird is the best New Zealand icon. And the kiwi thinks it should be him, but the pukeko is rapidly taking over. These two are to remind me of the social aspects of reading aloud to children. Lynn and I read to our two children over many years and know, as most parents do, what a wonderful finish to the day that can be. However, it wasn't until I started doing school visits as a writer that I discovered the magic can also be there in the classroom. My preferred age group when I started visiting schools was years 4 and upwards. Over the years it has crept downwards until I'll now happily work, split infinitive removed, with younger students, even new entrants. Usually I'll show them a few of my science gizmos, and then I'll read a story. It works every time. I leave the room feeling good about what I've done, and they feel good about my having been there. Very early on, I did a full day at a college on the North Shore, where I was given 90-minute slot with all of Year 10. 200 of them. If you're a secondary school teacher, you'll know what that's like. I did my usual presentation, followed by questions, but that still left 20 minutes, and I'd run out of ideas. The HOD English came to the rescue. She handed me a copy of Whale Pot Bay and said, "Read to them." So I did, from the beginning, and that kept everyone happy for the rest of the session. Hearing stories read aloud seems to calm the listener, but I suspect there's also something more. By listening together to the same story, we somehow make a connection with each other. I use this totem to remind myself of what it was like being a full-time classroom teacher. During my teaching career, I taught around 8,000 students and had contact with a whole lot more than that. Not all of them were receptive to my teaching. And like all teachers, I developed strategies to cope with the less motivated. I will mention 2 of them here. The first is the aside, or diversion. I've used a few here, depending on your point of view. You can call them an aside, diversion, or whatever. Teenagers like to sidetrack the teacher. Get the teacher talking about something entirely different. You've all done it. I used these opportunities to tell stories that I hoped would help them remember the content of the lesson. It was a bit like giving a character in a novel some quirky attribute that will help the reader recall the role of that character. Over the years, I developed lots of these asides. Some were true, most were not. It didn't matter to the students, they were happy for the interlude. I now realise that I was using storytelling to calm and unite the class. And it worked in that regard, but not in the one I intended. Often if I meet one of my ex-students today, they'll say, I remember when you told us about, and they'll go on, and usually it's not the true story, it's not the way I told it. But yes, the student does remember something from being in my classroom. The problem is they know the stories, but have forgotten the stuff they were meant to learn. The second strategy is about the story arc. Look at this little fellow here. I think he would have had some problems at Rosehill College. To begin with, his hair is well outside the grooming guidelines set down by the college. And yet he's smiling, his eyes are wide with anticipation, his arms are out. Everything about his body says, let's go, I'm ready for work. Just the way we hope our students will be when they enter our classrooms. Unfortunately, in secondary schools, our students are not always like that. But if it is to happen, most likely it will be at the start of the year. I always considered the first week of lessons the most important of the year, not to set the behaviour standards or rules or anything like that. I felt it was an opportunity to hook students into my subject while they were still smiling. I had a mantra for these lessons. Start with a stink, end with a bang. I now know it was just the story arc in a different form. At the start of this period, I'd get their attention by doing something stinky, messy or scary, something that conflicted with their senses or expectations. Then we'd get down to the lesson. When it came to the end, I'd do something exciting, something that would end up with a whoa, something that would leave them feeling good about the lesson and keen to return for the next one. When I think of these things, the asides, the start with a stink, the end with a bang, I recognise that I've been a storyteller all my life. I'm just doing it in a more structured way these days. I like this idea. I like the idea promoted by this poster. To be a writer for fiction, you need the imagination of the child combined with the wisdom of an adult. Imagination of a child joined with the wisdom of an adult. The problem for me is that the two often don't get on well together. Conflict between them can cause some difficulties and always has. The child part of me seriously considered structuring this presentation like a lesson. He wanted to start with a stink and end with a bang. On the other hand, the adult me said, hold on, this is a really special occasion. Stinks can go horribly wrong. People have allergies these days. You could kill someone. As you've seen, the adult won that round, but the child part is still nagging away, talking to me. Come on, Des, you got to do something. Do some chemistry, mate. End with a bang. So I will. I gave away the stink, but I can't give away the explosion. Anyway, explosions are much more controllable than stinks. Usually. And I'm going to use my cool nukes totem. This represents cool nukes. And there are several explosions in cool nukes. And it's only natural that the cool nukes totem should explode. Now, as you can see, it's got a red button. That's the thing that Donald Trump has control of these days. That triggers the explosion. Well, it just doesn't happen when I press it because we've got to have something to explode. And I'm going to use breath freshener. This is a little tube of breath freshener. And it goes, you're meant to have 2 of these and so on before you ever go near anyone. And it works fine. And so I'm just going to put 1 squirt in here. Whoops, I missed. Hope it's... Oh, I've messed it up. I've recently done a mid-career self-assessment, and I've judged myself against these two criteria. And I reckon I've got that first part really sorted. It's the second of the two that I think needs quite a bit of work, but I'm working on it.
Well, it's almost evening, actually. Good evening.
Yes.
I'm Bridget, and I'm Margaret's daughter, one of the daughters. And I wanted to say thank you very much for that wonderful, wonderful talk. And as you were doing your lovely science experiment at the end, I thought that Margaret may well have felt a degree of envy because, of course, she would have loved to have been able to do those kind of actions herself. You know, there's stories about being a storyteller, and in some ways we are all storytellers, whether we do it verbally, whether we draw out the little stories of our lives, whether we draw out the larger narratives in our lives, whether we place it on the page or on the artwork. Margaret would have really enjoyed that speech because she would have had a New Zealand context for it. She grew up in a small town in Whakatane. She had many cousins, so she was ranging the streets of her neighbourhood. And she wasn't always getting into trouble, but she did have a few adventurous stories, as befits an extended family. And as I listened to you, I thought about Margaret and the fact that she did many, many years of travelling into the school environments. And you'd have to take it as it came, as an experience, in that the children react on the day individually according to what they see and hear appear before them. She would have, much like yourself, done those stories, whether she had the words, she had her props, as you identified, and she constructed stories either with the words that she had written or she created little dramatic moments. I think she would have loved to have heard the stories that you told that are kind of anchored in the workplace and in the local environments that we all inhabit, and that she would have recognised your stories from your own personal experience. So, on that note, thank you very much.
Yes, I have the greatest pleasure in presenting you with the 2017 Margaret Mahy Medal. You are a truly worthy contributor to this legacy we've got of great storytellers, of people who've made an enormous contribution to our world of children's literature and children growing up. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.